thank you so much for the generous and kind introduction, and for the invitation. Great roster of speakers, and I'm not just saying that because I'm one of them, but I'm flattered to be a part of your fall speaker series. I think I'm going to sit down, if that's. Oh, a stool. Okay.
Stool, ladies.
Oh, okay. I kind of need to see my screen. Okay, this works, right? Okay. Okay, so for the presentation this evening, I've organized my slides, or rather my images, in more or less chronological order, just so that it seemed to me a practical way of showing my work, or presenting my work. I've selected groups of works from starting about mid-90s, after I finished my undergrad studies, and as they seem to me to sort of represent and embody my intentions and things that I was asking in the work as I remember them. And I think this applies for many artists, not just me, but the best way to think about the work over a span of 20 somewhat years is as a kind of continuing evolution, where things or ideas sort of fold into one another, rather than one thing strictly leading to another. And I guess having some distance of time and space to the works that I've made gives me a certain kind of perspective at this point. So I have lots of images, so I'm going to go through them quickly, and on some I may speak a little bit more or spend a little more time than others, because I do want to get to the more recent stuff. Okay. And if you have any questions while I'm talking, just feel free to shout and interrupt me. Okay. So these are a couple of images that I pulled. They're from about 1994. The questions that I was asking at the time in painting was its status, its object status, and its relationship to the wall. So painting as an object and space as it takes up a place on a wall. And so these two are just sort of iterations or pieces that I made in my studio, actually. So it's an informal context in the studio. And just to say a couple words about them, you know, I have, for instance, on the left, I have a painting that's made it's on a wooden panel, next to, painted in blue, and next to an area that's painted straight onto the wall. So, you know, you might consider both independently as a painting, but seeing it situated in this way, you might come to ask or think about the relationships. And then, of course, if you start to think about the space, and the actual space of the room, in the context of that, that you start to think further out. And so these are a couple of examples. I should also say something about the colors that I was using at the time up until about 2001 or so. I was working specifically with what's known as mistints, and they're basically, what they are is custom mixed house paints that have been rejected. So I got to work as a scenic painter after I left school. I had a friend who was an art director and doing commercials and such. So briefly I worked as a scenic painter, painting these large sites. Basically, sites are these large stage where you shoot a commercial or film or whatever. And so it was also the time where I got to have an experience of working in different scale, because the sites are, they're rather large space or wall space, up to 20 feet or 25, something of an architectural scale is what I'm trying to say. So it gave me an experience, it gave me an exposure to working in a scale that I hadn't done before. Anyway, so as a scenic painter, I would often go to the paint store to get paint mixed or colors mixed, and I would see these stack of colors, paint that was marked down, and what they were are rejected colors for whatever reason, and they interest me in that, not so much about why they were rejected. I didn't really care so much about that, but simply the fact that they have this, they're sort of failed colors. So they were, in a way, sort of culturally marked as failed colors. And so I decided to work with these colors. I didn't particularly experience any shortage of color, and I started to archive, or I started to make my own inventory of colors. So I would make swatches, and then they would get into my inventory library of colors. They would be encoded, and I would be able to use the same color again in different projects. So it became a kind of a system. Yeah, I think that's what I'll say. So I'm going to go through them quickly. This is this is a piece. I was invited to do an exhibition in 1996 at this gallery called Acme in Santa Monica. And this was a kind of a literal exercise of taking an object and how do I make that into a space. So I took, for this opportunity, I took a painting that I had made, I think a year prior to this exhibition. And literally, I wanted to blow it up. And how do I make that into a space? So I took the painting and proportionally scaled it up and painted directly the same motif onto the walls of the gallery space. So in a sense, when one walks into the gallery or walked into the gallery, that you would be enveloped in my painting. I would also mention, and I'm going to show you some projects in the next few slides, that I started to have a studio practice that was where I made paintings, and it is a more solitary practice. I'm in the studio myself and I'm making things, and I started to also do these site projects, usually by invitation, where we say, well, we have a gallery or we have it's an institution. Would you like to do a project? And so these two aspects of what I do to this day is they have sort of informed one another, and it's become, it's to this day, this is how I see my practice. I have a studio practice. I have a practice that deals with site works that are, and often it involves collaboration, involves working with different kinds of material that's not available to me in my studio often involves fabrication and technologies that is not that I'm not familiar with, and this becomes more evident towards later projects. But I thought I'd mention that. Yeah. So this is I'm going to go through a few of the early site projects just to give you some examples. So when these opportunities came, I would consider the site, the venue, and I would respond to it in some way. And often my decisions were sort of referential or indexical to some aspects of that space, and this would become more sort of evident as you see. So this project, this is, for instance, this is it's an artist-run gallery space in Vancouver, British Columbia. I was asked to do something there, and it's on this, sort of, in Canada, this is known to be the most notoriously sort of dangerous street, Hastings Street in Vancouver, and it's really, there's just a lot of users on the streets, but I mean, I ended up going back to Canada years later, and I was teaching at Emily Carr. I was a faculty there for 4 years, so I've gotten to know this street well. But at this time, I was asked to do something at Or Gallery, and it's a storefront space in a kind of, on this Hastings Street. And so what I decided to do was to paint onto the glass of the windows. Thus thereby sort of cutting into thereby sort of making that surface more surface opaque. In terms of colors here, I was sort of responding to the neighborhood and my choices, and so there are 3 vitrines, and you can see part of it here. So from the street, it's entirely opaque, and you would walk in, and you would see the same colors basically painted in the gallery. So there's a sort of a lapse of time. You'd have to physically move through the space to get to the gallery, and the height of this base was the height of the base of the vitrine. So it refers back to the dimensions of the structures, vitrines in the front. This is another example. It was in 1998, and this building, which is it's a rather iconic building in Los Angeles on the corner of Wilshire and Fairfax. It was at one point, initially actually, it was a department store. It's probably before many of your time, but it was a May Company department store. And once LACMA, the museum, had acquired this building, there was a program run by this curator named Howard Fox. He ran this program called Windows on Wilshire, and I was asked to do something. Again, I painted straight onto the walls here, and I guess I was sort of interested in this kind of window, which is kind of a transparent wall. Once it's opaque, by painting the color paint on and when you're standing in front of it, you are reflected in it, and there's a kind of doubling that happens. And also the fact that you have to kind of walk around the piece to experience the piece was of interest to me at the time. The other thing that I started to do was to, this was a space in San Antonio called Saladias. It still exists, actually. It's now turned into a nonprofit. But when I was invited to do something, it was still an artist-run space, and I was visiting artists at the UTSA during this time, and I've gotten to know some of the artists in town. They asked me to do something there, and it's a very modest 2-bedroom single-family home that's been turned into a gallery space. And so at this time, I started to build these walls that are leaning into the existing structure. At the same time, I was making shaped canvas paintings in the studio, and this was a kind of an iteration of shaped canvas in space, using architectural materials. And so you would come to a piece like this, and it's both, there's architectural materials, and it looks like a wall. At the same time, there's color and paint on the surface. So there's a kind of confluence of painting and architecture here. I often liked, one of my favorite parts of this piece is, if you look at this corner right here, the floor dips because it's, as of a lot of houses, old houses, there's things nothing's really, level or straight. And so there's this sort of a hole in the corner. And the decisions often are, as I've said, sort of based on existing conditions, existing elements in the site. So, for instance, I brought out a wall that is situated between these 2 windows. So, as I was saying, I was making shaped canvas paintings in the studio, and sort of exploiting this expectation of a painting being a rectangular structure. So I made these paintings that are slightly off. For instance, this painting from distance might appear to be perfectly rectangular form, but it's actually a trapezoid. So height of one side of the painting is sort of the shorter, about an inch. And I think that what I could say about this work is how it was actually made. I think I made a sort of a decision to not have to think about composition every time I want to make a painting. It seemed I wanted to focus on color, and I just didn't want to have to think about or deal with composition every time I make a painting. And so in my mind, I decided sort of a non-composition composition. So I would simply divide the width of the canvas into equal sections. And I decided that that was just simply going to be a kind of a structure for the paintings I was making at the time. Each color has a good 8 to 10 coats of paint. I made these colors, I applied the colors using a paint roller, like you would get one at the Home Depot. And I would do a light sanding in between. So the pigment really builds up. And the surface, the feeling of the surface, which you can't tell, this is no way to really look at a painting, but the surface becomes really dense and very dry. It's all the feeling of the surface is that it has a certain kind of weight and density. And so you probably know this, if you can take any color and do a single roll, and you can do this, you can do another roll, you can do the same color and say roll it out twice, and you can see how different they are. Right? So it's the pigment concentration of these colors is such that the appearance changes with the density of the pigment. Okay. There's a lot you can say about color, in that it's always color is an experience that happens in the moment, in the present moment, and it's a feeling, really. It's a sensation. And sure, there are many ways we can sort of make associations, but when you're standing in front of a painting and experiencing color, it is really that, you in front of a painting. And I will stop talking about this. So I'm going to go through them quickly, and this is another group of paintings, terra firma, and again, they're slightly shaped. This project, this was actually a painting show at Suzanne Bielmetter. Some of you may remember her first space, which was on Wilshire. And it was a storefront and a very sort of very long corridor-like space. I think the width of the gallery was maybe at most 15 feet. So it was a long sort of hallway-like space. And I made these two paintings for this space. These were kind of sided paintings for this space. My intention was for the experience of this painting to be also the experience of this space. So these paintings, they were facing one another. You can only imagine, 12 feet of space. You can't really back up far enough to see the painting that is 17 feet wide in its entirety. It's an impossible proposition. And they were facing one another, so you couldn't see these two paintings in one view. You'd have to physically move around. This was somehow interesting to me as a painting show that was made particularly for this gallery space. Also, the lines, the geometry of this painting is such that it plays with the perspective of the architecture of the space, in that it could sort of it could feel like that there's a sense of sort of stretching or compression through the lines and the perspective. I'm going to talk about another site project. This was a project made for Yerba Buena Center in San Francisco. And this was a project that I've considered the site as beyond the physical limits of the gallery space. And some of you may have been in this building. This building built in I think it was in the 80s. One of the things I experienced in going through this space, this building, was built by this Japanese architect named Fumihito Maki. And one of the things that you cannot avoid in going through this space is the presence of the grid from the floor, the ceiling, the windows. You couldn't get away from it. I mean, it was to the point of where it was sort of aestheticized. So I wanted to propose through the project this the oblique into the system of grid, and built two large walls. I mean, it's a pretty large gallery space. I think it's about 5,000 square feet. So I was building. I've been making these leaning walls in site projects, and for this, I built two leaning walls that are kind of crashing into one another. There's two planes, and that are asymmetrical. It's kind of like an A-frame, asymmetrical A-frame. And drywalled the surface and painted in these bands of colors. So this kind of gives you a scale. And there is a sculpture court that you can walk out to. It's just a kind of, it wasn't particularly well used, but it's an area that it connects to the streets of San Francisco. You might recognize MoMA actually right here. So as a way to sort of extend the project, I took the colors and printed onto vinyls and attached them to the steps of in the courtyard there. People usually only go out there to like have a smoke and hang out. I mean, there wasn't really any art to look at per se. And I guess I was trying to sort of somehow activate this space. Across from it, you would see these louvers, which are part of the building, and I've attached the vinyls onto the louver, where the architecture of this building is articulated through surface in this case, whereas in the gallery, it was really the volume of that space that I was dealing with the structure. And then I took it outside to the municipal San Francisco, and I wrapped a bus. This ran during the course of exhibition. I wanted the bus to actually I tried to pick the bus that was gonna stop in front of the center, the museum. I quickly found out it was impossible to do that because they actually assign the bus on the day of, so it's impossible to have a bus that's gonna stay on that route. So it was this kind of wild card during the course of the exhibition. People would call me and say, saw your bus or got on the bus. So it was just sort of ran around, in the city. So in some sense, the colors in this work function differently as from when it is on the surface of the walls in the gallery to the bus here. And I also actually made, as part of this kind of expansion, an artist book, which I don't have an image, but it was a fold-out artist book that folds to the shape of the walls that you saw. Okay, are we doing okay with time? I'm a little bit paranoid that I'm gonna be is this 7:40 right now? Yeah, okay. Okay, then I think I'm okay. I took a little time off after that. I didn't make work for I didn't show work for a few years after that. Wanted to take a little time thinking about my relationship to architecture in my practice, and so I took some time off, and I think that certain things changed subsequently. I went back to school, and this is a project post this sort of break. This is at the Yunhee Graduate Center in New York. The site is on Fifth Avenue. It's part of the City University of New York Graduate Center. Prior to it was a department store, and it was actually the first department store on Fifth Avenue. And what I found, and the gallery is on the street level that wraps around Fifth Avenue, and I think it's 35th. What I found interesting about this space and knowing the history of this building as a department store, that and being in the gallery, there was a kind of visual sort of reciprocity between the street and the gallery. People are, and it's a very busy street, as many streets are in New York. There's people walking, and so people look in, and the displays in the gallery want to be looked at, and there's this kind of two-way sort of exchange, and a kind of a theater, if you will, and so it led me to think about theatrical drapes as the material for the project. I should also say, prior to this project, I've always made, for site projects, the work was always made in situ, and once the exhibition was over, it was destroyed. And I think from this project on, I think I have a different sort of attitude, and I was considering a kind of continuity, and so this project actually kind of performed it. So I took basically, so this is a map. This is a diagram of So this is, if you can imagine, this is Fifth Avenue, and and these are windows. So there's windows that wrap around, and so I wanted to have these drapes that are in a, what do you call it when it's enclosed? In a kind of a circuit. So we designed this track, and this is just a chart showing the drapes as it references aspects of that space. So I measure the walls, I measure the windows, and made drapes that indexes these dimensions. The drapes were two-sided, so there was no sort of front or end. It was just simply that there was one side, this was one color, another side, the other side was a different color. And so I had drapes that ranges from, about 2 feet wide to like 15 and a half feet. And I hung them. But I hung them in such a way that it wasn't entirely closed. So it made a kind of a space in between, and that you could sort of see through. And people walked through them. This is a great artist there, actually, Tony Fair. He passed away. And so this piece, once the exhibition was over, the curator that I was working with, Linda Norden, and what was I gonna do with them? So I had them stored for some time, and eventually we had it resited for the Hammer Museum for the Lindbergh Terrace. Some of you may have been to this space. And this is a kind of an indoor-outdoor sort of space between the galleries and the other side, where people usually walk through this area when you have to go to the restroom. And it's a pretty dramatic area because of this massive eyebrow window. And so I designed the track to mimic the window, and also modify the piece to reflect some of the areas of the terrace, some of the dimensions of the terrace. So this is a map of the track system. I also started to think about the function of this space. The museum uses this space in different ways. Sometimes they have events there, and other times when they have exhibitions that take over the entire museum, that they have to take the piece down and use the space for another purpose. So this kind of use and the function of the space was considered in the design of the track system, so things could be moved. So you can see part of the track that that I designed, and this is simply an illustration. I really thought of the piece as a kind of soft pavilion. So when you walk through the place, when you walk through this terrace, that you could walk inside and walk through it. And because it's indoor, it was exposed to outdoor, there's always a sense of movement and slight air movement. And I like that sort of response to the environment that the work is in. I should say at around this time there's also sort of a shift in my painting, where I have I've had sort of a renewed interest in sort of pictorial possibility of painting, and interested in gesture. One of the first things I did was this group of painting. I used a sprayer to make the painting. A sprayer that you could buy. It's a very inexpensive DIY level of sprayer, and so I made these paintings. They're all framed in colored frame. And spraying was an interesting kind of gesture. During this time I was working out of my garage studio, converted garage studio, and I had installed barn doors to my studio so that spraying took place outside. I would hang the painting on my barn door and spray on there. When I'm spraying, I'm not actually touching the surface of the painting. I'm at a little bit of a distance using the sprayer. And also I'm outside and there's wind factor and I'm wearing a respirator. And this whole setup creates this sort of a process where you can't know exactly what you're gonna get, so to speak, when you're spraying. Those of you who may use spray paint know what I'm talking about. And so, but this was exactly what I was interested in and what I was enjoying in making these paintings. And soon I've started to work with squeegees in addition to the sprayer. Squeegees sort of came about in my wanting to figure out how to put a lot of color, a field of color, rather quickly. And I just wanted the color to be there. And so, how do I do that? Of course, squeegees are used in screen printing, and so I had one sort of laying around in my studio, and I started to use it, and it was very interesting because I didn't quite. I wasn't using it in the way a screen printer would use it. I was using with different end in mind, and I accepted all the sort of incidental marks that would be considered, a mistake or something like this. Also, that squeegees and sprayers both have a direct. The body has so much to do in the way the thing comes out. So the pressure of the body, the position of the body, became a very active agent in making these paintings. And I'm just going to go through them. This is a sculpture, a light sculpture I made using fluorescent bulbs that are painted. And this is, again, a set of paintings, a group of paintings that I showed in New York. This way of working and this way of making paintings, what I've come to understand and is that each painting has its own kind of constitution, and I don't know, maybe some of you are painters, that it is, you start a painting and you have some sense of it, but really you're kind of going in without knowing where you're going to come out. You are not quite, you can't know as in the beginning what you're going to end up with. And you have to accept that, because otherwise you have to figure out a different way of making a painting. And for me, it's always been something to do with the tools and the material of paint itself, as a kind of a process. And so, so tools that are not really meant to be used in the way in the trade, or that I'm using it in a way that is out of sort of that is not the conventional use of some of these tools. It interests me to use it in that way. I'm also using paint in a paint that is very liquidy. So there's it's less. I mix a lot of medium into the paint, so it feels more like liquid, like milk, rather than butter or something. So the consistency of the material produces, it can produce an entirely different effect. So, and you know, some of you are painters, know even different manufacturers. The consistency and the varies. Okay, I want to get to a couple more things. I think there's a few more. Okay, this is a site project I did a few years ago, Equitable Vitrines, which is run by these two people, Matt Connolly, who's an artist, and Ellie Lee. And it's in this building, this sort of mid-century office building on Wilshire Corridor. And really the site of the space are these two very funny vitrines in the lobby, one in the south lobby and one in the north lobby. And so they've invited different artists to do something in this space. And not atypical of office buildings during this time, it had a really generous lobby, pretty spacious lobby. And we were trying to figure out when these vitrines were installed. It wasn't part of the original design. We think that it was sometime in the 80s, but we tried to look into it. We did some research, but we couldn't figure out when it was put in. It was designed as some kind of display case. And so what I did was I took the glass panels off the vitrines, and we actually cut a set of exact same dimensions because we didn't want to use the ones that belong there. So we cut the glass and I painted straight onto the glass. Excuse me, I poured paint straight onto the glass. I used this sign paint and let the paint dry and mix and in time. And it created this sort of very wild mixture of color. couldn't really tell exactly what I was going to end up with because it took time for it to settle and dry. So the idea, one of the idea was that this is essentially a kind of a corporate environment, office building that have a certain sort of range of surfaces and colors, muted tonal colors, and so these the colors of this vitrines really sort of call attention to itself. It's a kind of interruption in this space, and of a sort of a different order entirely. I also installed a timer so that it would go on for hours and then it would go off. It wasn't sort of on and off flickering, but that it would stay on for hours at a time and it would go off for hours. So if one visited, you wouldn't necessarily see both state. But it was really primarily for the people that actually worked in the building, who come in and out of the building, on a daily basis, that they would perhaps notice the piece looks slightly different, or it's lit up. Oh gosh, I have more paintings. Okay, these are paintings that I made in my new studio, not too far from here. It's a kind of a continuation of working with a very, the flow of paint, there's more brushwork here, and going from fields of color to lines, and so a continuation of, and primarily the composition here was vertical orientation. Okay. Red Carpet in Sea. This was a collaboration with architect Peter Tolkien and his office. This was at UCR Arts Block in at Culver Center in Riverside in last year. This was a pretty collaborative project that involved expertise and experts from outside of my realm of knowledge. Worked with structural engineer, architect, let me tell you what they are. It's the material is, what you're looking at is canvas. The red is dyed canvas. We dyed this heavy cotton duck canvas. And the circular things that you're looking at are cardboard tubes. They're paper tubes that are wrapped in colored paper. There are 13 colors in this piece, repeated throughout the piece. So there are 3 bands. Each is 5 feet wide, and that undulates throughout the space. And essentially, it's a soft structure. And so let me show you a couple of. This is another view. So this building, what you just looked at, was yet another department store at one point, which is funny, and that, but that had turned into an institution, a gallery affiliated with UCR Riverside, and the style of this building is very sort of classical neo-Renaissance revival style. and the proportions and the spacing of the columns are very symmetrical. And when Peter and I were starting to work on this project and thinking about it, it struck us the feeling of this space is very static. And let's see, this was a picture when it was a department store. Our discussion, our conversation started to talking about our shared interest, the relationship between music and architecture. There's a famous saying by Goethe that said, architecture is frozen music and music is liquid architecture. And of course we think we experience music through time, and often in some kind of an architecture, and the relationship between music and color it's also goes back to, let's say, early 20th century abstraction. We were considering all these aspects and wanted to engender a sense of movement and introduce a form that is both an object and a space that you can enter into. So we came around to curvature in this space, and this is a couple of early renderings and drawings. We played a lot with the curves. One of the things we were also looking into was musical scores and notations of, experimental music. So scores and notations that do not use the traditional Western musical notations. And looking at people from Cage to Morton Feldman and Xenakis, and so there was all these sort of interesting aspects to consider. We at one point took some music and tried to, using a program, try to turn that into form. And I think that some of these models are a result of that. That didn't really work for us. And so what ended up, the curvature that we were after was not sort of catenary curve, which is a curvature, curves that work from gravity. So if you were to hold a string, two ends of the string, the curves that it makes just from the sheer gravity would be a catenary curve. We were after curvature or curves that were more parabolic. And so in order to get to this, took many sort of tests and figuring out. I also want to say the colors, also in the way that they run through the piece, encompasses, it feels something like a chromatic scale. So from yellow to, let's say, purple, there's a whole range of color that runs through the piece. And we So the colors are always, the color always works within some kind of environment. You couldn't experience a single color in the work in any sort of isolated way. If you were looking at an area, it would have multiple colors. It would be a sort of a field of vibration of colors that are happening. And so there's a kind of continuity this way, horizontally. They're two-sided. There's a top side and the bottom side to the form. The colors also go in diagonally. So they have their kind of independence, but they are also, they relate to one another. This project couldn't have happened without the team of 30 plus architecture students from Cal Poly Pomona, where we actually fabricated the piece. Each piece of the cardboard tubes had to be glued onto the canvas, and the curves were is made by the different length of tubes and the tension and the compression of these tubes, and so there was quite a bit of engineering as part of the piece. I want to show you a quick, oops. Sorry for the kind of slightly. This is just, oh my gosh. So I don't know how to.
Maybe you could drag it over.
Drag it over.
Yeah, there's like screens that probably right next to each other. So if you drag it off screen, it probably would.
Yeah.
There it
There
is.
you go.
To the right. Yeah. This was the actual installation of the piece in the space, which in itself had to be planned out to the T, just because of the sheer scale of the work. So upon entering this space, okay, enough of that. Okay, so upon entering the space, you would be stepping onto the red carpet, the red canvas, and then the piece, as it rises, becomes something like a wall, and it can go over you, something like a ceiling. So it creates a space that you can sort of be under. And so I'm going to show you a few more pictures. Okay, I'm going to spend 5 more minutes just talking about this. This is the last slide. This is the piece that I think Karen had mentioned earlier. This is Hammer Lobby. I was invited to do something for this Hammer Lobby project, and I consider the history of the space as an exhibition space, which is, it's not a conventional art viewing space. It's not a conventional gallery. But what has been happening over the years is that these 3 large works have become more or less the site of the projects for many of the people who've done work there, done a project there. So I wanted to, I like the lobby as a transitional space, and in some ways it's a kind of an anticipatory space. You walk into it and you are on your way to the gallery, you're expecting to see the museum, and it's a kind of an exciting space. Of course, it also has a function with the staircase. I wanted to address the floor as a painting, so to speak. And this is a model, a rough model that I made. The thing about looking at the floor as a site of artwork is not, let's say, a proper sort of viewing geometry. It is slightly, the perspective, because you're looking down, it's slightly distorted or distorting. But I liked the fact that one would actually be in the piece, and that it would have a kind of a direct engagement with the viewer. One of the things I think I knew from the get-go is that I wasn't interested in making something that was a one-to-one scale. I was interested in trying to do something that involved some method of projection in the process. So I took the plan, and this is pretty much the plan, and I divided into these 5 sections. And I was going to make work at a 1% scale, and that was going to go through some process and eventually be scaled up to the actual size. I decided to work, but it was a little bit hard to wrap my head around blowing something up 100%, 100 times. So if I made something, let's say a 1-inch square, that would end up being 100 inches. And this sort of shift was interesting to me because it was a little bit out of my reach to sort of imagine. What I decided to do was to work with this sign paint. This particular palette of sign paint, and I decided I was going to use every color in this sign paint made by Ronin. Typically or traditionally, sign paint is relegated to commercial use of signage and graphics, which today, by today's standards, and it seems like a kind of it seems like a vestige of another era to think about somebody actually making a sign using a sign paint. Nevertheless, it interests me to work with sign paint in its I like the sort of the viscosity of this paint, and I used a transparent film to pour the paint on, and I was surprised to get the sort of the intensity of these colors, the saturation of some of these colors, and how they mixed into one another. And so that led to some of the other decisions. For instance, certain details about this space. The title of the piece is Up Close in Distance, and at times the bars in this piece that runs along the staircase have all the colors that are used in the piece itself, so they're kind of a key. And these triangular areas, which I call flags, are also the colors that are used in the piece. So in some areas they give a certain kind of information. In other areas a certain kind of information, and they work, they sort of adhere to the existing sort of anatomy of the staircase. In other areas, the color sort of overrides these sort of architectural moments. So another thing about this process that was interesting was to how do I actually get a work that is at a 1% scale to 100% ratio, and without losing the details and without losing all the information that is there. So what I ended up doing was to use the lens of the camera, use photography to record the surface of the artwork in order to be able to scale it up. And because the original work is so small, you had to be so close up to be able to record, and the mechanical eye of the camera lens was the only way to do this. And maybe some of your photographers. So the idea, the process was something like using a gigapan camera to record the surface, always at a constant distance from the surface throughout. So you're kind of panning across the surface of the artwork, but what the camera records is these, essentially these tiles, sections of the image. So we use the same principle in digitizing the artwork into files that were large enough to be able to support the scaling up. And it was something like looking at the surface of the work like if you were an insect, or looking under a microscope or something, and then pulling out to something like a telescope where you're looking at the entire span of a field. So this, the distance of seeing, there's a great sort of range in what was recorded through the camera and what ended up being on the surface in this space. So and then it was printed onto a vinyl flooring material that people can walk on. And one last thing is that earlier I was saying the walls were where the artwork mostly takes place in this space. I did in fact paint the walls, although in this image it's very difficult to tell. It's easier to tell in this image. So the three primary walls were painted in a very, very light shade of pink. And it's almost imperceptible when you're in it. I think sometimes people don't realize the walls were actually painted. It is perceptible when you step out of it, and when you look towards the area, it sort of the reflections and it creates a sense of volume. And but again, it's easy to miss when you're in the space. Anyway, it is up for a bit longer. So if you have time, if you happen to be there, please go walk on my piece. And I think I'm gonna stop there. Any questions?
Questions? So how did you choose your color palettes, like throughout all of your works? Did you stick, because I know you said that you had made that initial like archive
Yeah.
mist tints, like did you stick with that kind of color palette that you created? How did you select for all your colors?
Yeah, I think my relationship to color changed over the years. When during the time when I was sort of making a log of my own colors, and I had a sort of a library of my own colors, I would do. I did many color studies. I do still, and so I, certain set of colors that I was working with that are in some ways sort of pre-chosen for me because they were marked as mist tints, and I would work with them. It's often that I would do these color studies and then sort of living with them and then making a decision from there. Sometimes the colors decisions are more about, well, I would say most of the time the color decisions are about relationships. So it's what colors do to one another and how much of that color is there. It creates a certain sense of itself, right? And so it sort of works in that way. My relationship to color, or the way I work with color now, is a little bit different. Once I stopped working strictly with mist tints, I think that my relationships and my decisions in color became a little bit of my own, and colors that belong to, let's say, nature or something, and colors that are synthetic, or and what happens if they're next to one another. So it's a certain, you're after a certain kind of mood through color, and it's what they do to one another. And there is no sort of formula. Sometimes you look for a certain opposition, or sometimes you look for a certain sense of tension, or sometimes you look for some kind of, some kind of counterpoint. And so you sense these things, these sort of effects in color. Of course, there are also colors that, point to other things. I remember in the 90s, there was a time where honestly everybody had something orange, like, or brown and blue became this like hot combination. I saw so many things, you know. So it's also always, there's a relationship to culture, of course, always. And so, you know, it's working through all these kinds of effects and references, and then what do? You know, you're making a painting, but it is also infinite. It's almost impossible to mix a same color twice. I mean, you could try and you can get pretty close, but it is a kind of infinite range of possibilities. So, and colors work in different ways. Colors work like language. I mean, we have colored lights, traffic lights, for instance. I mean, we have to understand that the red traffic light has to mean something, and very clearly to everybody, for it to work in that way. So it works like a language there, but at the same time, in the realm of aesthetics, in the realm of that there is something that is before this kind of function, or in addition to it, or sort of a kind of a surplus effect, and that has more to do with sensation. It has to do with it's a really a kind of crazy phenomenon. I mean, color is essentially, we're looking at a reflection, right? A light hits a surface, it absorbs all the wavelength and reflects. What it reflects is what we're seeing as, I don't know, gray or green or whatever. And we're perceiving that through our eyeballs, which is not, you know, flat, it's round. And we all have our individual, peculiarities about our bodies. I mean, so the variable and it's always a bit of, I mean, in addition to all the elements that is in our environment, you know, the lighting, where are you, things, colors change throughout the day depending on the light, and so it's a constant, it's not still, it's not static. But I hope that sort of answered your question about my relationship to color now. So yeah.
I have a question. Can you speak a little bit about your relationship with the physical paint? Like when you walk into your studio and then you kind of are sensing a problem, or like you hit like a wall or something. Like you know, just like, can you speak a little bit about your relationship, like your relationship with paint, and if you ever hit like a wall or a frustration, and how you work with that frustration, and you know, something, and how, yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I can relate to that. Frustration. Well, I mean, there are always problems. It's always a problem. I mean, it's and I guess like any problem, you have to do something. You know, you have to do something, and then it gives you a certain, then it changes it, right? It changes it, and I'm speaking just sort of in terms of painting. And you have certain amount of certain options, and then you make decisions, right? Whatever that options, whatever you consider to be options for you, you know, that are available to you, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I think if I'm getting your question right, that the problem is always there. It doesn't go away, and it'll always be there if you don't do anything about it. So it's about engaging with it and seeing what happens. I mean, particularly with painting, it's you really, going in somewhat with a blind eye, and so as things happen, and you wouldn't want it in any other way, so you begin something, and you're not quite certain where, you never know where you're gonna sort of end up with it, and but it is, and seeing what happens. Yeah, so when there's a problem, when you feel like there's a problem, when you feel like there's a wall, you just have to do something, and respond to it.
You said your interest in music, like the red carpet in C pieces.
Yeah.
So is there any influence or of music in your work, or what kind of music?
The piece I talked about, I forgot to. There's a sort of reference, not a direct reference, and not but to Terry Riley's in C, in the piece that we spoke about, Red Carpet in C. But the music is similar to color in the sense that it evokes our senses, right? So you're hearing something, and my work, I can't say that it has a sort of a direct relationship to it, if that's what you mean, but you were asking me if the music is influential to me? No, wait.
Like choice of color or the.
Oh yeah, I see. It's not a one-to-one relationship. I don't think of it in those terms. What would be a good way of saying? I think that there's been historically a lot of sort of a lot of people have talked about music in relationship directly to in relationship to color, for instance, and somehow when you sort of equate one system of effects to another, I find it to be, I find it limits. I think that there's a lot of parallel, often color, the language of color, we use music, the language of music and color sort of share vocabularies, but I don't work directly in that way as a sort of interpretation. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Maybe we'll make this the last one.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for showing your work. I think it's great to see the evolution. And I think all your installations have photographed very well. And I think I've heard that you thought your red carpet installation was too Instagrammable.
I mean, Instagram is simply part of our lives now, right? So it's not, and it's this is how we are, and the sort of we live in a sort of world with incredible amounts of images that just passes us through all the time. So, I mean, my intention is that in my work is to have a different relationship to time in the experience of the work, and that you know, it's a bittersweet thing. It's not something to even, it doesn't even make sense to sort of say, oh well, I'm just gonna stay out of it. I don't know if that's a real option. I suppose it could, but it's fine. I mean, I see it as it is what it is. That we consume images and we hardly respond to it. It just passes us through all the time, and experiencing art is different. It needs time. So it's counter to the culture of Instagram, where, you know, hundreds of images just goes right through you, and so I'm always a little bit ambivalent about do I post this stuff, or, you know, so that's what that my expression was about. But ultimately, the experiencing and looking at, we need to slow down to look at things, particularly painting. That really, it's counter to the world and the pace of things that we all participate and we are part of, you know. So for time to slow down and look at something that doesn't do anything, that's just there. It doesn't move. It doesn't do anything fancy for you. So this is a kind of you know, it's a kind of a difficult and challenging proposition to most of us. I mean, even myself. I mean, I read less. I was talking to a friend and saying how less I read. And because we're all doing emails and, you know. I would like things to be different when you're looking and experiencing an artwork. You just need to stop and look at something and not do anything else, you know. But yes, it's on Instagram. I'm quite
Thank you so much.